Forbidden Planet had an 11-minute segment removed by MGM in 1956 that was never intended to be shown in theaters. And Frances and her pet tiger were part in the scene. Censors panicked over something involving power, innocence, and an old tale. Only a few people were aware of it for decades. The scene clarified the reason behind the tiger's unexpected attack on Altaira following their initial kiss. However, the explanation was too contentious for viewers in the 1950s. What MGM concealed reveals a sinister secret about the actual significance of the movie. Two matte painters entered MGM in 1952 with a script they named Fatal Planet. They had never written a screenplay in music before. Alan Adler and Irving Bloch were not respected. Back then, science fiction was seen as a place to dump low-budget throwaways, or repurposed monster outfits and music, leftover actors were sent. However, their pitch had a different, musical, quality. Two men who thought in pictures rather than words were the source of it. For them, a planet was a place, but also a blank canvas for technology, stillness, wonder, and terror. At first, MGM threw it away, but it persisted for a while. By 1954, things had changed. Studio executives were no longer ignoring the explosion of television or the increasing interest in space. MGM took a chance and looked it over again. That dusty pitch was taken out of a drawer and subtly changed into the planet that would be prohibited. One of the most costly science fiction experiments ever conducted. Not only did MGM approve it, they placed a wager on it. A genre that typically made between $150,000 and perhaps $500,000 was given between $1.90 and $2 million. The studio's goal was not merely to produce a science fiction film. They wished to make it more prestigious. From scratch, set designs were created. Instead of fading B-list actors, the cast included rising stars like Leslie Nielsen and in music, Frances, who were coupled with Walter Pidgeon's Gravity. Every dime was used to transform a genre that no one appreciated into one that people couldn't take their eyes off. The industry paused for a moment as a result of MGM's audacious decision. Was it a new future or a stupid risk? Executives at MGM even discussed the price in whispers. The gamble, however, paid off. It didn't simply recoup its investment. By demonstrating to studios that stars didn't have to be inexpensive to shine, it altered the meaning of science fiction. The story's original setting was 1972. However, it seemed that the technology in the script was too extravagant and unrealistic to be even close to the actual chronology. Thus, they propelled the narrative 200 years into the future, arriving on the far-off planet Altair 4 in the 23rd century. Shakespeare's The Tempest was subtly referenced in the central plot. In the future, Dr. Morbius became a prosp. Music, Miranda was replaced by Altaira, his daughter. The monsters weren't simply monsters, either. They were influenced by the human psyche, drawn from the subconscious, much as spirits of vengeance by Shakespeare. The picture was distinguished by its subdued blend of trashy genre and high art. It was more than spaceships and lasers. Power, ego, control, and terror were all ingrained in the brain so deeply that not even the stars could shake them. MGM gave Fred M. the directing position. Music, Wilcox, who had never worked in science fiction. Lassie Come Home was his most notable accomplishment. MGM wasn't searching for a genius to reimagine the genre, despite the fact that it raised eyebrows. They sought someone who could manage a large cast, a large set, and a strict timetable. Wilcox provided. Everything seemed stranger in the greatest way because of his outsider viewpoint. It wasn't shot like a science fiction movie. He filmed it as if it were Shakespeare in space. No winks at the camera, no nods to the audience, and no quips were there. He gave it significant consideration. The bizarre storyline was grounded by such weight. He allowed the spectacular effects to flourish while maintaining the narrative's focus on the human faces at its core. The screenwriter, Cyril Hume, made changes to the script. He transformed Bloch and Adler's graphic notion into something more profound. The psychology of Freud began to seep in. The monsters ceased to be mere physical dangers. Symbolizing repression and yearning, they were derived from Dr. Morbius's own thoughts. Hume was more than just a dialogue writer. He added mythical, psychological, and literary aspects. The story was reminiscent of prior pain, distrust of authority, and the destructive power of information. It was more than aliens. It was about the shadowy parts of the human psyche hidden beneath a gleaming curtain of sophisticated technology. MGM asked 58-year-old Walter Pidgeon to play Dr. Morbius. He had played respectable parts in prestigious dramas for decades. He did not use the term sci-fi. Almost, he said no. The genre wasn't what made him reconsider. It was a storyline that was reminiscent of The Tempest and the promise of a $1.9 million production. Pidgeon witnessed the tale at Wait. There was no camp. It was a warning. He played the role. By doing this, he gave the movie the necessary gravity. He used constraint to ground the chaos. At the age of 23, and Frances entered the set donning what would go down as the first miniskirt in movie history. Her startling clothes were created by Helen Rose. Their fashion breakthrough was over 10 years before Mary Quant's. Executives were anxious. The film was banned in Spain until 1967. The appearance persisted even after conservative venues withdrew. Altaira, barefoot, innocent, and futuristic, rose to fame not only for her beauty but also for her defiance of social norms. Frances became a part of the future, not merely a wearer of it. Commander Adams, the sober moral head of the crew, was portrayed by Leslie Nielsen. He was the straight man before he became well known for his humor. In Forbidden Planet, he was a formidable presence. He appeared to be a member of a spaceship's bridge. His part hinted at what would eventually become Captain Kirk. Later, Nielsen made a joke about Robbie the robot being the true star. He was partially correct. The character that realized it too late, Doc Oro, was portrayed by Warren Stevens. His last words were monsters. In 1956, monsters came down like a hammer from the ID. The majority of viewers sensed the ID even if they had no idea what it was. His character died quietly and horrifyingly off-screen. The Krell's old machine broke him when he attempted to utilize it. It was made worse by the calmness with which Stevens delivered it all. There was no monster to be found. Inside, it was. Music, Robbie the robot didn't say what he thought. Although he did not receive credit, Marvin Miller provided his voice. Frankie Darro, a stuntman, was in the outfit. Darrow's time was limited. He almost passed out mid-scene after having a few drinks at lunch, and he was fired. Despite this, the movement and the voice came together. And Robbie was immortalized. He was more than a machine. He exuded charisma. He was a novel character. Cordial, lethal, and enigmatic. The initial showing of the movie wasn't even in Hollywood. The Southeastern Science Fiction Convention was held in Charlotte. On March 3 and 4, 1956. Hollywood arrived at Grauman's Chinese Theater on March 23. It was uncommon for a genre movie to get that kind of release. Forbidden Planet debuted loudly with cinemascope and stereophonic sound, although the majority of science fiction films made quiet debuts and were screened late at night. At Grauman's, it performed for 6 months. It was regarded as an epic by MGM. There was no score by mentioned as the music credits rolled. Instead, Lewis and Baby Baron dubbed it electronic tonalities. According to union regulations, they would not be recognized as composers. Instruments were not used by the Barons. Circuits were constructed by them. They broke stuff to make music. Static, feedback, loops. Even though their work wasn't considered music in 1956, it nonetheless altered the regulations. The reviews were not quite consistent. It left several commentators unsure about how to interpret it. The New Yorker believed it to be a prank. Even though they were nicer, British critics were perplexed. The psychology, the monsters, and Shakespeare didn't all fit together well. Others saw only color in machines, while others saw brilliance. However, despite the uncertainty, the film's popularity continued to rise. Instant permission was not required. It was intended to be long-term. The movie earned between $1.20 and $35 million abroad and $1.53 million in the US and Canada. With a tiny music profit of $210,000, it came to slightly about $3 million overall. Not the smash that MGM had planned for, but not a bomb. It was the 35th highest grossing American movie of 1956. Reputable. However, the true story was not the figures. Later was when it mattered. It was nominated for a 29th Academy Award for Best Special Effects in 1957. It was defeated. The winner was The Ten Commandments. But, music, the prize wasn't necessary for Forbidden Planet. Light drew upon its beast. The sky was painted. It had weird, handmade, and useful consequences. That something had changed was demonstrated by the award nomination. A clip from Forbidden Planet once attempted to explain something that viewers never quite grasped. It was silent, evocative, and disturbing. At approximately the 11th minute, Dr. Ostro brought up Altaira and her tiger. A unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin, he explained. Additionally, he observed a comparable ability of Altaira, music, to confidently command and caress a mature tiger. The scene was not included in the final cut. MGM was frank. The metaphor of the virgin unicorn was too explicit for the motion picture production code at the time. A woman's supernatural power over animals, derived from her sexual innocence. They couldn't allow that to be shown in theaters in 1956. Altaira's tiger turns on her after she gives Commander Adams her first kiss. It acts without hesitation. The animal that used to lie calmly next to her now perceives her as a danger. There is no explanation in the final version of the movie. Although it seemed to have been an isolated violent incident, it wasn't. It would have been evident from the cut scene that her control over the animal ended with that kiss and that one romantic awakening. The second innocence disappears, just like in those ancient myths where the unicorn runs away. There is more to the tiger's lunge than just danger. It has to deal with loss, change, and anything irreversible. That scene was only found in a book for many years. Written by Philip MacDonald under the pen name W.J. Stewart, the novelization of Forbidden Planet was published in 1956 before to the film's theatrical debut. It maintained the unicorn line. It was written out word for word. How Altaira's moral rectitude restrained the tiger. The majority of readers believed it to be only an artistic flourish. They were unaware that the scene had been filmed before being buried. For nearly 2 decades, no one outside of MGM noticed any indication, music, that it had ever been shot. MGM has a policy. Eliminate all work printouts. It was not their intention for different versions of their films to circulate. They did not want the public to see raw cuts. However, Forbidden Planet managed to get through. The old print of music was discovered in a lost archive in 1977. The unicorn scene was there. It featured raw sound, varying takes, and alternating dialogue. The precise reason music was kept is unknown. It's possible that someone forgot. It might have survived because someone couldn't bring themselves to burn it. And everything was altered when it reappeared. The print of that piece was restored. It first appeared on a Criterion Laserdisc. First on the 50th anniversary DVD, then on Blu-ray once more. Fans who had grown up seeing the theatrical production at last realized what music had been lacking. The tiger, the myth, the kiss. It all made sense. Altaira wasn't merely an ingenue from space. She embodied a metaphor. Layers of innocence, sexuality, and the unspoken boundaries Hollywood wasn't prepared to breach were all intertwined in her story. Additionally, there was another issue that caused debate in 1956. Altaira experienced a dreamlike scene in which she swam by herself, floating across the water. She appeared to be completely nude. Word spread quickly. In a science fiction film, Anne Francis appears nude. Still, she wasn't. She was dressed in a skin-colored outfit. The thin, seamless material was meticulously crafted to resemble bare flesh in the presence of light and rippling water. The deception was too successful. The audience was furious. Letters of rage were written by morality groups. A few cinemas removed the movie from their schedules. MGM was forced to make public declarations. However, they were not believed by the public. No, and Frances was never nude. No, nothing indecent had happened. They were astounded that it was only angles and lighting. Cinematographer George Foley avoided seams, used precise lighting, and allowed water reflection to conceal the borders of the outfit. He created a scandal out of music by wearing a bodysuit. The crew was taken aback by how authentic it appeared. MGM sought to push the envelope without going overboard. They managed to do both. MGM trimmed 6 minutes from the film when they attempted to re-release it as a cat matinee in 1972. There was no swimming scene. So were a few flirtatious conversations. Anything that gives away too much. The film's edge was absent from the G-rated version that was released in theaters that year. The tamed version was seen by children, for years. The original unedited version wasn't shown to audiences again until long later. The movie was not permitted in Spain. There was a restriction on Forbidden Planet for more than a decade. The swimming scene and in Frances's miniskirts were deemed objectionable by Franco's Spanish censors. It wasn't the spaceship, the monsters, or the words. It was the outfits. She had too much body exposure and too low skirts. Spain didn't see the movie until 1967. In Spain at the time, it was still seen as dangerous, even if it had already established a classic abroad. And Frances nearly wore a more modest outfit. Helen Rose, MGM's costume designer, designed a silver lane garment that completely encased her from neck to hem. Even silver gloves, see-through shoes, and a matching hood were included. Yet when Dorsherry, the head of MGM's music studio, saw it, he said, "No, too revealing. Too sexy." It was tight, yet it showed no skin at all. It glittered. That was sufficient to render it intolerable. There is no footage of the outfit. There are only costume test pictures. Most people were unaware of the technological achievement that lay behind all the drama and metaphor. It was a fake painted desert in the background. A 350-foot cyclorama, a curving painting, was displayed on stage 15. It appeared as though an alien landscape would never end. However, the music and lighting have to be precise. The background's painted sun had to match the set's artificial sun. The illusion would fall apart if the angles weren't right. Foley used 96K10S, 192K5S, and 40 skylights with 10 1000W bulbs each to illuminate that painting. Because of how much power they consumed, more lines had to be run from other stages. It took a tiny army of electricians to complete that one backdrop. The spaceship followed. The entire set was filled with a 51 M flying saucer created by Arthur Altaira. The size of a genuine structure, it measured 167 feet across. The cast was overwhelmed. When MGM executives arrived on set, they instantly raised the budget. In the end, the movie cost $2 million. That was unprecedented at the time for a science fiction movie. The spaceship was more than a set, though. It was an obligation. The stakes were heightened. Everyone had to give it their all. MGM employed 4 of its largest soundstages. That has never been done in a movie. A distinct portion of the Earth was held by each. The alien environment, the control center, the Krell laboratory, and the spaceship. The stages all ran at the same time. In overlapping shifts, crews constructed, filmed, and disassembled. It rotated continuously. The demands were severe, and precise coordination was required. This was no ordinary genre film. It was a construction site for music encased in a fantasy universe. They constructed a 16-foot plexiglass globe within the spacecraft. It has bands of gleaming steel through its outer and inner shells. It mirrored everything. Everything in the room, including the personnel, light, and cameras, reflected off the globe. Masking lights, covering equipment, hiding individuals, and blocking glare were all necessary to get one decent shot. Setting up a single angle took hours. The globe, a gorgeous nightmare, became a legend on site. The Krell laboratory was next. There was more to it than lights and wires. Over 1 square yard of plexiglass, 12,500 feet of neon tubing, and 50,000 feet of cabling were involved. 15. Music, electricians worked on it. To make the circuits pulse, lights flash, and panels blink as if they were alive, they used 110 different switches. They had to run cables from other stages because the power needs were so high. And each switch has a purpose. Mid-scene, their hues changed. They modified the pulses. Although it appeared to be extraterrestrial intellect, it was simply human grit. In Forbidden Planet, everything seemed larger than it actually was. The riot-instigating clothing, the concealed metaphors, the missing sequences, and the sets that depleted power systems. People watched the movie for a very long time without realizing what they were missing. However, it seemed like opening a locked room when it was rediscoverable because of those gaps and those silent erasers. MGM invested $125,000 to construct a single robot in 1956. Robbie was the robot. He wasn't just a background tool. The focal point was him. The expense accounted for 7% of Forbidden Music, Planet's $1.9 million budget. At the time, most science fiction films couldn't have imagined making that much money for their whole production. At today's exchange rate, that amounts to almost $1.2 million. The whole thing was transformed into something that didn't speak, breathe, or blink on its own. Robbie didn't only stand there, though. Gears turned and lights flashed as he spoke, blinked, spun, and moved. He had a dome of plexiglass for his head. Gyros, pilot, music, lights, and revolving spheres were all present. He seemed to be alive as everything moved in time with him. Before anybody else strapped in, it was actor Frankie Darro. It was hardly a glitzy affair. Pitch black, hot, and, music, suffocating, the robot stood 7 feet tall and was built of rubber and metal. The head was partially electrified and there was no ventilation. When Frankie attempted to record a scene after drinking a few martinis, he nearly knocked the robot over. It did not amuse the studio. His every move was agony. He was exhausted by each movement. And none of that suffering ever shone on screen. Robbie wasn't finished, even after the movie. MGM dispatched him all over the place because they needed to get their money back. In 1957, he was cast as the lead in The Invisible Boy. He thereafter became a popular guest on television programs including More and Mindy, Lost in Space, Columbo, The Addams Family, The Love Boat, and The Twilight Zone. A walking Easter egg, he was a relic that, music, kept coming back to. He had new wires at times and new paint at others. The silhouette, however, remained constant. He even appeared on the same screen as Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny in 2003. It was not a career of cameos. A second life, that is. He was referred to as Hollywood's hardest-working robot, music. However, Robbie was not just metal. There were restrictions for him. He was constructed by a character named Dr. Morbius, who gave him rigorous instructions that followed Isaac Asimov's 3 rules of robotics. No hurting others. Obey commands and defend oneself, but never at the expense of the other 2, music, precepts. These guidelines influenced the narrative. Robbie declines to battle the invisible ID monster when it attacks. He locks his circuits. He knows deep down that the monster is a part of Morbius, which is why he is frozen. He is attacking his own master if he goes after the monster. It was one of the earliest instances of a movie robot adhering to ethics as well as directives. And sci-fi was forever altered. However, Forbidden Planet did more than that. First of all, neither violins, music, nor trumpets were used in the soundtrack. Circuits were used in its creation. Baby Baron and Lewis did not play instruments. Their machines were self-built. There is only pure voltage, music, and sound, no strings or keys. It was the first film with a score composed entirely of electronic music. It wasn't music in the background. It was the tension, the ambience, the mood. Not even the Barons referred to it as music. Since the American Federation of Musicians forbade them from referring to it as music, They called it electronic tonalities. According to the union, it wasn't considered human if it wasn't played with traditional instruments. Thus, the Barents received second-tier credit despite producing something revolutionary: music. The procedure was harsh. They did not construct reusable circuits. Each had an own tone, character, and lifetime when it came to music. They recorded the last sound made as a circuit ultimately overloaded and died. The death wail was incorporated into the score. DEB Baron was then had to manually cut and splice hundreds of tape segments. Hours of repetition, tape, and blades, no software, no undo button. Without her, the noises would have been lost, although she later described it as a miserable work. Every part was distinct. There was nothing to recreate. Their strategy went beyond experimentation. It was a philosophical discussion. Music, the Barons viewed machines as more than tools, influenced by Norbert Weiner's idea of cybernetics. For them, they were living things in their own right. Feedback triggered the circuits. They changed. They evolved over time. Every one of them had a beginning, middle, and end. Because of that belief, their machines became co-creators. A moment of life was captured with each beep and screech before the circuit burned out. On screen, the monster roared while the soundtrack buzzed and whispered. A man in a suit was not the ID monster. Joshua Meter, a Disney veteran, did the hand animation. Each frame was drawn frame by frame on translucent vellum. It took months. Only if it made it through the ship's force shield could the flaming shape of the creature be seen. It was undetectable, menacing, and unsettling. It was too frightening, according to state censors. A few asked for changes. It was uncommon for an invisible monster to push back like that. This, however, touched a nerve. Perhaps because there was no such thing. There was a notion. Freud was the inspiration. The creature was more than a danger. The subconscious itself was the cause. The ID, the raw anger, lust, and fear that reside beneath all minds. Morbius was unaware that he was producing it. Though it read his mind, he believed the old Krell machine was safe. Not only those he buried, those he confessed to, and those he didn't even comprehend. And those thoughts turned into weapons. The Krell had constructed devices that used more than 9,000 underground thermonuclear reactors to transform ideas into reality. However, they didn't consider limiting the machine. The Krell died as a result of their own irrational concerns. Almost the same event happened again in one night. They employed the Krell technology. And the monster came back as his jealousy erupted. Because of this, Robbie, music, was unable to stop it. The firearms didn't work because of this. They were fighting a mental battle. It was Morbius, the monster. And his suffering, his longing, his refusal. The beast was strengthened by it all. Altaira wasn't even secure. The focal point of it all became music and Morbius's daughter. Her purity, her developing feelings for Commander Adams. Morbius felt something tug on him. A twist. He never uttered those words. The monster shouted, however, as Altaira kissed another man. It wasn't called forth by Morbius. He was it. His subconscious struggled to take charge. The anger, jealousy, and possessiveness all showed itself in the most Freudian manner. The incestuous undertones were later noted by film reviewers. Altaira was not the object of the monster's desire. Its goal was to shield her from everyone else. And Morbius himself was ultimately the one who suffered the most.